Good evening. It is my sincere pleasure to welcome you to our second Fulbright Forum presented by a 2011 program year grantee. Tonight we are joined by junior researcher Daisy Kim as she presents her work on understanding South Korea's multicultural project. In her presentation, Daisy will trace South Korea's evolving history with respect to the growing presence of diversity in Korea's demographic profile. Historically, Korea has been known as one of the most ethnically homogeneous societies among world nations. Its former nickname of the Hermit Kingdom is indicative of this fact. However, during the past several years, this has been changing rapidly due to an influx of migrant workers and married migrants, and mostly from Southeast Asia. Daisy will examine the recent policy decisions of Korean lawmakers that have affected this significant change in course toward a multicultural society, or damunhwa sahoe. Ultimately, she hopes to eventually answer the questions of why such a course of action has been pursued by the Korean government toward the fashioning of such a society. Daisy is a PhD candidate in political science at Johns Hopkins University with a master's degree in East Asian Studies from Stanford and a BA in political economy from Georgetown. Oh, the very prestigious university. Through a Fulbright grant, she is conducting dissertation research on the relationship between immigration and state-society relations in Korea. In 2006, she interned at the U.S. Embassy in Seoul, and in 2010, she worked with Korean Migrant Women's Center. Following tonight's presentation and a brief Q&A session, I hope that you will join us a very light reception on the third floor. And now, let's welcome Daisy Kim.
Thank you, Mrs. Shum, for the kind introduction, and I'd like to thank KC for this opportunity to present my work tonight, and thank you all for coming. I have to preface this by saying that I've been battling a terrible cold all week. I only just got my voice back yesterday, and there's a possibility that my voice may not last throughout the talk, but I'll try my best to be as audible as possible. Can everyone hear me right now? Okay. But I do apologize in advance if it's difficult to understand me at some point. So my presentation is titled Understanding South Korea's Multicultural Project, and it outlines my dissertation on understanding the relationship between immigration and state civil society relations. So originally when I envisioned this project, I was actually focusing more on the government response to multiculturalism, but since I've been in the field, my project has evolved, and it's been focusing much more on the government-civil society relations, so hence there's been a little bit of evolution in the project. So before I jump into the presentation itself, just out of curiosity, I want to get an idea of how many of you already know about the topic that I'm talking about. So how many people here tonight have heard of the term damunhwa or damunhwa society? Okay, great. Probably the majority of you. And how many of you consider Korea to be a country of immigration at this point? That's very interesting. That's very interesting. Good. So many of you have an interest or familiarity with the issue. So hopefully I won't be boring you to tears. So I'll begin with the presentation outline. I'm going to start with the theoretical background, give a little bit of the rationale for the case selection, and then talk more about the empirical case, the migration trends in Korea, give you a little bit of the demographic context behind why migration has been occurring. And then I'll delve into what I call the multicultural project. I'll kind of define what I mean by the multicultural project. Then I'll move on to the state response, focus a bit on state-society interaction and the fashioning of the multicultural project, and then talk about the civil society response, and then wrap up with sort of the kind of dominant critiques on the multicultural project, and then finish with some of the future questions that I want to answer in the project. So in this day and age, many of you will agree that we currently live in an age of migration. According to estimates by the IOM, a few years ago, there were more than 200 million migrants around the world, representing approximately 3% of the world's population. At present, the three largest destination regions of migrants are Europe, followed by North America, and then Asia. Now, in conjunction with what is happening in terms of migration flows, studies of migration and immigration have grown exponentially in recent years. The increasing politicization of immigration issues has also led to scrutiny over the relationship between immigration and the nation state. Now, as entities that regard territory and membership as sovereign rights, it's not surprising that states would want to seek to control immigration. States have a variety of tools, as we know, at their disposal to control and regulate the flows of people, whether it's citizenship to visa regimes to outright coercion, as in the case of forced deportations. But the rising and persistent numbers of undocumented migrants in most, if not all, countries of immigration, as well as the extension of greater rights to foreign residents, means that states are both inhibited as much as they are empowered in their attempt to control immigration. Among so-called liberal states, states have had to accept, quote-unquote, unwanted immigration due to their liberal values and pressures to conform to international norms and or because of market pressures. Now, in recent years, scholars of immigration have identified two major hypotheses in regard to immigration control. The first is called the convergence thesis, which argues that there's a growing similarity among industrialized labor-importing countries in terms of, one, the policy instruments chosen for controlling immigrants, two, the results of the efficacy of immigration control measures, three, the implementation of social integration policies, and four, the general public reactions to current immigrant flows and evaluations of government efforts to control immigration. The second is the gap thesis, and this states that there's a gap between the intended goals of immigration policy, such as in laws and regulations, and the actual outcomes of those policies. Now, while these hypotheses may be generally applicable to the wide range of country cases, especially in Western Europe, these theses fall short in explaining why it is the case, and how or in what ways states are converging and how they are experiencing policy gaps. At the same time, scholars have continued to point out that despite the seeming decline in control by states, nation states are still very much center stage. They're the central actors when it comes to controlling immigration, especially when they decide who they want to let in and how much they want to integrate them into society. However, there's been a lack of elaboration on how it is that different types of states control immigration differently. Second, by concentrating primarily on the state, such studies fail to show how it may be interactions between state and civil society and or market forces that shapes policies and immigration outcomes. So my project situates itself in this theoretical gap in a quest to understand how it is that state-civil society relations shape immigration outcomes. And so when looking at immigration countries, there's traditionally been a way of categorization into three different categories. The first are settler countries or settler nations, countries that have been settled as countries of immigration. These are US, Canada, and Australia, to name a few examples. The second category are usually called traditional countries of immigration. So these include countries that have had long histories of immigration, whether it was through colonization or through slavery or trade or whatnot. So these include Great Britain, France, and Germany. And then the third categorization, which is where Korea often fits in, is the latecomer countries of immigration. Now, these are countries that have traditionally been considered countries of emigration, but only in the past few decades have turned to becoming either labor importing countries and have been experiencing more increased inflows of migration. So these include Spain, Italy, Japan, and South Korea. Now, I actually regard this characterization as somewhat problematic because it preempts the ways in which comparisons can be made across different categories of cases. Rather than looking at the whole domain of cases, so the entire world, it may be more productive to look interregionally and to understand what is happening in what I call most similar cases. So by most similar cases, I'm looking at East Asia, namely Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. And so when looking at East Asia, we want to say, well, what are some distinguishing features about immigration to East Asia? And so I've identified three. In contrast to Europe, the first one, refugee policy is a relatively small component of migration flows. So Korea and Japan do have refugee policies and they do admit refugees, but in comparison to Europe and as well as the US, the refugee flows are quite minimal and limited. Second distinguishing feature about immigration in East Asia is the prominence of guest worker systems. So permanent settlement is only open to a very, very small, limited number of migrants, and the majority tends to be low-skilled labor migration that is regulated and controlled by the state. And then the third feature I look at is the prevalence of marriage migration, and coupled with that, the lack of family reunification rights. So by family reunification rights, I mean the rights of migrants to host and invite their family members as settlers into the host country. But in the case of East Asia, family unification rights are not granted to migrants. And the only way is through spousal reunification rights. So if you're marriage migration, if you have a spouse who is a national of that country who is willing to host you to become a permanent resident or permanent settler to that country. So looking at the case of Korea, as we all know, is historically an immigrant sending country, right? As we can tell, the Korean diaspora is one of the largest of all diasporas. South Korea has transitioned into a labor importing country in the past 2 or 3 decades. Prompted by labor shortages and demographic changes, Korea's importation of foreign labor parallels the experiences of many European countries, such as Germany, that opened its doors to foreigners, and this often happened in the midst or in the aftermath of rapid economic growth. Now, present migration trends indicate that Korea will follow in the steps of other advanced industrialized countries to become a country of immigration that increasingly grants social, political, and economic rights to foreign residents. Now, whether this is the case today is much debated. Now, moreover, in the Asian region, Korea is not the only country that has experienced increased migration inflow because of demographic changes, right? So Japan has also experienced similar trends, especially when it comes to international marriages. However, the distinguishing feature about Korea is that is the centrality of international marriage as an immigration practice, right? So in Japan, even though there have been international marriages taking place, often from women coming in from Thailand or the Philippines, the policy response to it has been very limited, localized. There's been no national level policy shift on immigration that's been driven by international marriage. So what I say is kind of peculiar and puzzling about Korea is that it has implemented policies for integrating migrants, and these are actually marriage migrants. So quote-unquote what we call multicultural policies. It has done so without opening its doors to immigration, to full-scale immigration. That is, Korea is not a country of immigration in the traditional sense, and that the only permissible immigrants, i.e. are those with immediate family or blood ties to Koreans. But it has instituted policies that make it appear to be a quote-unquote multicultural society. So then why is this the case? So that's kind of been my driving research question behind the project. Of course, one could say that there are multitude of reasons of why this is the case, but I wanted to explore this issue first by looking at the interaction between state and civil society. Now I'm going to turn to the empirical case itself to give you some facts and figures about what is actually happening in Korea. So according to figures from the Korean Immigration Service, now this is a bureau under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Justice, there were nearly 1.4 million foreigners sojourning or staying in Korea at the end of 2011. And this includes short-term visitors as well as long-term residents. Now, of these, 982,000 were registered, or 등록 외국인. So these are long-term foreign residents, but not to be confused with, permanent foreign residents. The Korean government also records figures on undocumented residents as well. And there's currently about 167,000 undocumented migrants. This number has actually been reduced in the past year. The Yeoseong administration waged multiple crackdowns on deporting undocumented migrants, and so they've shrunk that number. It used to be almost double that number a couple of years ago. Now, so taken all together, foreigners, including short and long-term residents, as a percentage of the total population is 3%, and this is projected to increase in the future. A little bit about the ethnic composition of registered foreigners. As you can see, the Korean Chinese, 조선족, or 중국동포 as they're called these days, compose the largest portion, occupying nearly 40% of registered foreigners. And this is actually as a direct result of policies that have favored the recruitment of ethnic Koreans as migrants. And then you see that the two following groups are the Han Chinese and then the Vietnamese. And this is actually due to the marriage migrants. Next is the growth in the foreign population. This is from 2000 to 2008. As you can see, there's been a nearly five-fold increase in the period of, 2000 to 2010. So the past decade, there's been nearly a five-fold increase in the number in the size of the foreign population. Next is the average percent increase in the number of foreign residents from 2000 to 2008. So and this is across OECD countries. As you can see, Korea ranks number 1 in terms of the average percent increase in the number of foreign residents. So they've marked it at approximately a 20% annual increase on average. The next following after Korea is Spain and then Italy. So what have been the pull factors for migration and flow into Korea? And I've grossly oversimplifying this, but I identified two main sources. So the first pull factor for migration has been labor shortages. So due to structural transformation in the economy following rapid industrialization, Korea began to experience labor shortages primarily in the low-skilled sector, and this is concentrated on the manufacturing and construction sectors beginning in the late 1980s. Now, in response to these shortages, small and medium-sized enterprises began to actively recruit foreign workers, especially, this is true especially in the years leading up to the Seoul Summer Olympics in 1988. Now, the problem is that there was no policy in place for employers to recruit labor from overseas. So what ended up happening was that there was a huge spike in the undocumented population of workers who basically entered on tourist visas, and then they, once they sought employment, they just overstayed their visas. And then in order to address the problem of the rising numbers of undocumented workers, the government implemented the Industrial and Technical Training Program in 1994. Now, this was the first system of its kind of foreign labor regulation put in place, and it consisted of a 1-year training period and a 2-year work permit. However, a few years into it, it became clear that there were many problems with the system, including abuses of worker rights, excessive brokerage fees, as well as continuing growth in the numbers of the undocumented population. So a lot of these workers found that they could actually get higher pay as undocumented workers. So they ended up running away from their legally assigned jobs and became undocumented, and thereby earned more money to pay off their brokerage fees. So this was becoming an increasing problem. So then in 2004, a new system was introduced to correct the problems of the ITTP, called the EPS, or the Employment Permit System, and this is still in place. It's called the kyeolhon. Now, unlike the ITTP, the oversight jurisdiction went to the government agencies. Before, it was the Korean Federation of Small Businesses that was managing the guest worker system, but now it's mainly went under the Ministry of Labor. Among other governmental agencies. Now, the EPS is a comprehensive system that monitors the registration, the selection, departure and arrival orientation, as well as the job placement of migrant workers. Now, the sending countries are designated through official bilateral MOUs, and then every year the Ministry of Labor decides a quota on how many workers will be allowed in that year. At the time when it was passed, it was considered highly progressive for granting migrant workers the same basic labor rights as Korean workers. The system, however, it became clear soon enough that also had many problems inherent to it. For instance, the workers are not allowed to change workplaces more than 3 times during their stay in Korea, and this requires, and every time they change jobs, they're required to request the permission of their current employer, which employers are not likely to give anyways. And there also continue to be many problems with unpaid wages, workers' abuse in the workplace, and etc. So finally, it should be noted that the EPS was purposefully designed to limit the period of work to just under 5 years. So the maximum period of stay for workers recruited under the EPS is 4 years and 10 months. And this is because after 5 years of residency, migrants are eligible to apply for naturalization. So by limiting the number of years that they can reside in Korea, basically the system undercuts any sort of ability to naturalize or to settle permanently in the country. Now in 2007, the Ministry of Justice implemented the Working Visit Program. Now this is only for ethnic Koreans from China or the former Soviet Union. This is called the 방문취업제. Now the visa allows 3 years of unlimited multiple entry and exit, access to employment, but is generally limited to certain sectors. And then it can be extended up to, but not exceeding 5 years as well. So this is for ethnic Koreans only. So just a little bit more about labor migrants. So in terms of the high-skilled labor migrants, they compose a minority of migrants. So there's about 47,000 as of December 2011. Low-skilled labor migrants, as I've said before, compose the majority of migrants, and so they're a little bit more than 500,000 right now. By visa type, the EPS is generally the E9 visa. There's about 234,000 workers under the E9 visa as of 2011, and then for the working visit, which is substantial numbers, is over 300,000. Now the top 5 countries of origin under the EPS are Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, and Sri Lanka. Next, I'll move on to the second pull factor, which I quote as low birth, high aging society, 저출산 고령화 사회. By the turn of the millennium, 3 decades after instituting birth policies to curb population growth under Park Chung-hee, it became apparent to policymakers that Korea faced an impending demographic crisis with dire consequences for future growth, and they've been talking about this since pretty much the last decade, and they're still talking about it. More importantly, such demographic trends have been manifesting unevenly between the rural and urban areas. So in terms of low fertility rate in 2002 is about 1.26. It's been even lower than that before. So among OECD countries, Korea has one of the lowest, if not the lowest, fertility rates. By 2050, Korea, the UN estimated that Korea will have lost nearly 7% of its population size, so it is rapidly shrinking, along with Japan as well. And then finally, in terms of manifestations, one of the kind of immediate manifestations has been the dearth of marriage-age women in the countryside. One of the 2 main factors contributing to this is the rural to urban migration of women during the period of rapid economic growth. Women went into the cities to seek employment and for marriage and whatnot. And also sex-selective abortion practices that is no longer as prevalent today, but used to be in prior decades. Now, since the early 1990s, local rural areas have begun to experience these costly consequences to differing degrees. Now, the issue of this shortage of women began to receive significant media attention in the early 1990s when unmarried bachelors were found to be committing suicide in growing numbers, and the main reason was because they had failed to get married, and so they considered themselves as failures in life. And so taking the initiative, local governments and rural neighborhood associations devise a quote-unquote solution to the bride shortage by taking advantage of the newly established diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China. And this meant newly opened channels of communication with the Korean Chinese communities in China, and they began to conduct marriage matchmaking tours, launching the beginnings of what would become a widespread practice. In terms of international marriage, usually divided into two phases. The first phase is from the 1990s to about 2000. And this involved primarily Korean Chinese women. It was a predominantly rural phenomenon until then. And sham marriages actually became reported as a problem. So these women who were entering the country on the pretense of marriage but actually were seeking employment, and the marriage was actually fake. The second phase, the turning point actually, what I consider, and some people might disagree, is took place in 1999. The marriage brokerage system basically switched from a license-based one to a simple registration system. So before, people who wanted to set up a marriage agency, an international marriage agency, basically had to procure a license, and then they were able to engage in commercial activities. But then after 1999, and the mic disappeared again, all you have to do was to register the business, right? So this ended up in a huge, growth, explosive growth in the number of marriage brokerage agencies. So from 2000 to the present, this international marriage spreads as a nationwide phenomenon. It's not just contained to the rural areas, but spreads into the urban areas as well. And then in terms of the brides who are coming in, it's not just primarily a Chinese phenomenon, but people from Southeast Asia, South Asia, Central Asia. So it's become much more diversified as well. Excuse me. So this depicts the growth in international marriages from 2000 and 2008. And so as you can see, in 2005, there was a significant peak in the number of international marriages, representing nearly 14% of all marriages that took place that year, and that's probably been the highest proportion of marriages that's been taking place. Since then, there's been a gradual decline, but the numbers are still pretty high. The blue line represents the total number of international marriages, while the orange represents the ones that I'm talking about in terms of Korean men and foreign women. And that portion has tended to be about 70 to 80% of all international marriages, or even higher. Now this depicts the growth in the number of marriage migrants from 2001 to 2011. Currently there are about 145,000 marriage migrants residing in Korea today, and this excludes the number who have actually naturalized and gained Korean citizenship, and there's a considerable number of those migrants as well. Alright, that's it. And this is just, I thought it would be interesting, the international marriage brokerage ads. Have any of you seen these ads around the city or in the countryside? Yeah, I mean, they're still pretty highly visible. You could see them on the subways too as well. And then, the second picture there, it says damunhwa kyeolhon. So, marry with a Vietnamese maiden or virgin, basically. This graph shows the ethnic composition or the racial breakdown of the marriage migrants. This is a little bit interesting here. Basically, three major groups are the the Korean Chinese, and then the Han Chinese, which the Korean government actually separates and takes separate statistics on those figures. And then the Vietnamese have become pretty much the second or the largest group. And so China and Vietnam tends to be the two leading sending countries, and then the rest of the countries are significantly smaller, although it's still a very diverse group of countries. Now I finally get to the Multicultural project. Now, by the mid-2000s, it became clear to the nation's top-level policymakers that they could no longer ignore the issue of the growing presence of foreign wives and their mixed-blood children. State-based support for marriage migrants and multicultural families, which had never occupied a significant place in the policy discourse, was catapulted as a top national priority, signaling what I call a paradigm shift in regard to policies related to foreigners. Now, beginning in the mid-2000s, so around 2005, the central government begins to hold a series of meetings and public policy forums, calling together ministers as well as advocacy groups to discuss what the policy response should be to the changing demographic. In April 2006, in a consultative meeting regarding the national agenda between the president and his cabinet, the Korean government announced the, quote, measures to support the social integration of female marriage migrants' families and their mixed blood, and mixed blood individuals. These titles are always very long. The policy outcome of this meeting was what scholars have identified as, quote-unquote, the grand plan, which outlined the state's vision to transform society into a multicultural one through the social integration of foreign wives. Now, this marks the beginning of the Multicultural Project, and I call it a project because it's a deliberate effort by the government to engineer a very, what some might call a peculiar and a specific type of, quote-unquote, damunhwa society, centered around marriage, migrant women, and multicultural families. Now, the grand plan was envisioned as a comprehensive policy that outlined the tasks to be fulfilled by each of the ministries. So I'm just going to break down the 7 major objectives of this grand plan. The first was the regulation of international marriage agencies and the protection of foreign wives before entry to Korea. So there had been a lot of sort of trafficking issues, human rights abuses, in terms of how the women were recruited as wives. Second, to support the victims of domestic violence. There's a growing rate of reports of domestic violence in international marriages, especially through those that were accomplished through marriage agencies. Now, third, the support and orientation for newly arrived foreign wives. 4, support for children of international marriages in schools, and this meant reforming education, textbooks, kind of erasing the emphasis on Korea as a homogeneous society and saying that it was actually a damunhwa society. 5, supporting social welfare to foreign wives. 6, raising social awareness of multicultural issues. And then 7, creating a comprehensive support system, which is very vague, but it's kind of meant to be the blueprint for what they wanted to do. The grand plan was only the beginning of the government response to marriage migration. Now, over the past 5 years, the Korean state has continued to mobilize significant resources in order to attain the rapid social integration of marriage migrants and multicultural families. The present administration under President yeoseong has continued many of the damunhwa policies that were instituted by his predecessor. Now, from 2006 to 2010, the national government spending on marriage migrant integration increased 52-fold. And this may not be saying much because, to begin with, there wasn't much spending on multicultural families. For fiscal year 2012, the government announced that about 3% of the annual budget would be committed to providing services for multicultural families. In 2010 alone, the media reported that there were approximately 3,000 public organizations providing services to multicultural families. And then in the span of pretty much 4 or 5 years, the government went from having a handful of multicultural family centers to now there's about over 200 multicultural family centers around the nation. This just gives you an example of what the Multicultural Family Support Centers do. This is a picture from the damunhwa Multicultural Family Support Center, and so basically it's under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family, and then there's an intermediary government organization called the Korean Institute for Healthy Family that kind of manages and the kind of day-to-day operations of all the multicultural family centers. So basically, one of the main tasks that these centers do is Korean language education. Next is kind of cultural understanding education programs, counseling for families, interpretation services, bilingual education, education where their tutors are sent out to the homes when it's the case that the migrants themselves can't visit the centers. They dispatch in-home tutors as well. Now, the services for multicultural families. In 2009, the Ministry of Gender and Family conducted a huge nationwide survey on the situation of multicultural families. And this was a breakdown of how sort of welfare provisions are provided to the multicultural families. And as you can see, more than half is spent on Korean language education. So the brunt of that goes into teaching the migrants to speak Korean. Second was education on sort of social adjustment to Korean society. Then third is support for educating and raising the children, and then family counseling, and then the last one is support during pregnancy and birth. So I don't actually have time to go through all the major pieces of legislations that have been passed since the proclamation of damunhwa sahoe, but I'll highlight what I think is sort of the crux of the direction in which legislation is being passed in terms of incorporating foreigners into Korean society. The first is the Basic Act on the Treatment of Foreigners. So, 제한 외국인 처우법. Now, I included a quote that cites the purpose of this act, and I think it kind of sums it up nicely. The translation is a bit rough, but so the purpose of this act is to stipulate the basic provisions concerning the treatment of foreigners in Korea, to help foreigners in Korea to adjust themselves to Korean society, to reach their full potentials, and to create a society where Koreans and foreigners understand and respect each other, with the aim of contributing to the development of Korea and social integration. This act then further went on to legally define who is a foreigner, who is not, and then who are marriage migrants, basically. So in defining foreigner, the act says people who have not obtained Korean citizenship and legally stay in Korea for the purpose of residence. Now this purpose really excludes the undocumented population. I mean, Korea has had an undocumented population since the beginning of migration flows, so that's one thing to note. The second is immigrant by marriage. This is the first time when a piece of official legislation refers to immigrants, right? And the only time when immigrant is used is in reference to marriage migrants, so kyeolhon imminja. This is a non-ethnic Korean who used to or is in the middle of a marital relationship with a Korean national. This is an interesting definition. It says non-ethnic, and when we went and looked at the ethnic composition of marriage migrants, you actually find that it's actually ethnic Koreans that compose a significant portion of the marriage migrants. This piece of legislation also mandated the establishment of a basic policy foreigners to be renewed every 5 years. So there's a first basic plan on foreigner policy, which went into effect in 2008 until 2012, and they're now currently drafting the second basic plan, and that they will proceed henceforth. This act also outlines the government's commitment to providing services at the national, the municipal, and local levels to help foreigners adjust to life in Korea. And then finally, it has established a day called Together Day. 세계인의 날. It's May 20th of every year to celebrate multiculturalism or damunhwa in Korea. Other pieces of legislation, there's been a ton. The Basic Plan for Immigration Policy. This was also passed around the same time as the foreigner policy, and is currently being negotiated right now. The Social Integration Program, this was a piece of legislation that was aimed at encouraging marriage migrants to acquire citizenship as quickly as possible. And so they instituted sort of a language program that if you took certain hours of Korean language and classes on understanding Korean society, that you would be exempt from taking the citizenship exam. So it was sort of to accelerate citizenship acquisition. The law to support multicultural families. This is the law that basically designated the setup of multicultural family centers, right? And then this law defines multicultural family as thus, it's a family consisting of an immigrant by marriage and a person who has acquired Korean nationality upon birth, so a native or natural-born, native-born Korean. And then the second is a family consisting of a person who has acquired Korean nationality and a person who has acquired Korean nationality upon birth. And this is to include the marriage migrants who have naturalized and gained Korean citizenship. So years before the government actually embraced the project of integrating marriage migrants, civil advocacy groups were providing support at the grassroots level to the women who needed it. And these are some just pictures of some of the centers. There's a ton of centers as well, but some of the more influential ones in Ansan, there's the Ansan Injumin Center, and then in Karibongdong there's 한국 외국인 근로자 지원 Center, which has changed its name recently. And then the 한국 이주 여성 인권 Center, the Korean Migrant Women Human Rights Center. Now, in particular, these centers, what they did was to provide shelters for women who needed them, who had escaped very difficult domestic situations. Now, these activist groups recognized the marriage-migrant issues as a double-sided one, one that regarded issues of migration, but also one of gender as well. And that they also recognized that the needs of migrant women could in fact differ from the needs of migrant men. This is just some pictures. The one on the left shows, it was a protest organized on behalf of Vietnamese women. There have been some highly publicized homicide cases of Korean husbands who were found to be actually mentally ill, who had murdered their Vietnamese wives, and there are a couple cases of this. And so the advocacy groups wanted to raise awareness about this, and so they've waged public campaigns and have pressured the government to change laws regarding oversight over the marriage agencies. And the picture on the left is just a banner about opposing the government crackdown on undocumented workers. And so to characterize the government-civil society interaction in the creation of the Multicultural Project, I've basically identified 3 ways in which the government and civil society have interacted. The first is through consultation and advice. In their initial discussions about what to do and how to formulate multicultural policies, the government itself didn't have a very clear idea of what was going on the ground. And so they called upon the leaders of these activist organizations to participate on closed door and as well as public forums on discussions about what the policy direction should be. Second was also in developing education program services, conducting surveys, etc. So many of the language and the cultural textbooks that they use for multicultural families, as well as the service programs that are provided, were actually initially developed by advocacy groups who had already experimented with different methods, different teaching methods and materials. And so many of these were just directly adopted by the government, and they've been using those in their multicultural family centers. And then third was to identify and problematize the main issues, so the issues that should be prioritized in drafting policies. Now, activists often take credit for initially publicizing the issues associated with marriage migration. And so one of these centers was, as I've said, the Korean Women Migrants Human Rights Center, where I've been volunteering for the past year. Now, this organization has tirelessly publicized some of the major systemic problems facing marriage migration, especially the lack of government oversight over marriage brokerage activities. However, once the decision was made to put marriage migrant integration into the national agenda, and once they adopted multiculturalism as official policy, advocacy groups have seen the government somewhat usurping what they consider to be their domain. So, many of the multicultural family support centers were modeled on grassroots kind of welfare social organizations that have been set up by activists. And so many of the migrants who used to visit the advocacy centers are now going to the government-run centers. And so there's been sort of kind of hostility and tension on the part of advocacy groups in what the government has done. Now I'll turn to the limits of civil society. So the interesting observation for me regarding the role of advocacy groups has been that they strategize about their actions in relation to what they think is feasible and what's not. So in other words, this means that their responses to policy actions are often limited to the bounds of current policies, and they aren't actually pushing for drastic changes outside the scope of existing policies. So for instance, the activities, like I've said, of the marriage brokerages have been long criticized by activist groups for their human rights violations, etc. But not a single group, as far as I'm aware, even the ones that are considered radical, have proposed getting rid of the entire industry altogether. I mean, they just say it wouldn't be possible, the industry is huge, the government wouldn't go for it, it just wouldn't work. And so no one even talks about the abolition of international marriage agencies. So this begs the question of, why is it that advocacy groups are so limited? And I've kind of broken down that into two factors. So why is there a failure to think beyond the constraints of present policies? The first one has been co-optation through funding and commission tasks. What I call the co-optation of NGOs and advocacy groups by the government. And this happens through funding. A lot of the major foreign support centers receive some form of government funding, even if it's not fully. And often this is in the form of commission tasks. So the government asks a certain center to conduct some kind of field research report or a survey or whatnot. And when funding comes in that way, there tends to be a more cooperative effort on the part of civil society groups, even if they are critical of the government. So there isn't much of a push to oppose current policies. And then second is what I call the fear of marginalization. And so as much as they're critical of the government, the civil society organizations don't want to be completely ignored. And this is especially true of talking with the leaders of the organizations. Many of them tend to be these charismatic figures who credit themselves with having, formed these organizations and having been these, fighters who've protested against the government. But they thrive on the attention of the media and of high government officials, right? So they don't want to be marginalized, and so they will antagonize the government to a certain point, but they won't go beyond that. So basically, the consequence has been that there's the main limitation of migrant advocacy groups is that they're unable to provide a coherent and alternate discourse to the vision of a multicultural society. So the government has obviously this vision that it's outlined, and civil society groups have been criticizing it, but they haven't provided their own vision of what multiculturalism should be like in Korea. But despite this shortcoming, I do want to point out that advocacy groups should be credited for their persistence in raising their voices about what is problematic about current policies, and so I'll highlight a few of their demands. The first, what I consider to be probably the biggest criticism that they have of the multicultural project is the exclusion of migrant workers. So like I've said before, this multicultural project, even if it's in the name of all foreigners, all migrants, it's actually in the name of marriage migrants. And so migrant workers have, in some cases, benefited from the services that they provide to foreigners, but they haven't been the main recipients of it. And so a lot of activists are very critical of this, especially the labor activists. The second has been the marginalization of marriage migrant men. By law, the marriage migrant can be male or female. The law doesn't stipulate that. But in practice, in the actual granting of service provisions, the multicultural family support centers don't actually give services for marriage migrant men, as far as I'm aware. And there's a growing number of them too. So this is also a problem. Third is the lack of coherence in the deliverance of services. This comes from the fact that what I see is a lack of overseeing hub or center that directs where all the multicultural programs should go. So basically, each government bureau is in charge of its own, in trying to get its own little piece of the multicultural pie. And so what has happened is there have been repetitive and overlapping programs, leading to one competition between government agencies, and one of the biggest sources of competition is between the Ministry of Health and Welfare and the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family. And this is kind of due to the fact that the Ministry of Health and Welfare used to be the main government organization in charge of multicultural programs, but then that was handed over to the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family in 2009. They're not happy about this, so they tend not to communicate and they fight over resources. And so the competition is pretty fierce, and that actually works to the detriment in terms of effectiveness of the programs that are offered for migrants. The fourth, the programs have been directed too much at migrants, so it's all about assimilating the marriage migrants into Korean society. Oh, let's teach them Korean language and culture, but it's not enough on educating Koreans themselves. So a lot of the programs have started to include a component where it's about changing Koreans' attitudes toward foreigners and educating people about what ethnic discrimination is, etc. But that's not the majority of where the brunt of the resources are going, and so a lot of civil society groups have been critical of this. Fifth, there's a lack of genuine public debate and discussion on what multiculturalism means. Basically, through this proclamation of multicultural society, a lot of Koreans just think, oh, well, yeah, multiculturalism has arrived. Korea is this, advanced cosmopolitan society, and we don't really need to work towards it because the government already proclaimed that we're multicultural, so we must be multicultural. But what a lot of the advocacy groups have been saying, and a lot of people who've been critical of the project have been saying, well, what does multiculturalism mean anyways? If it's directed mainly towards a specific group of migrants, then can we really call this multiculturalism, or is it something else? And then finally, there's worries that there's been that this sort of approach to multiculturalism has been contributing to a backlash, basically a growing anti-marriage migrant, anti-foreigner movement, and these. This is growing. Especially on the internet, there's been a lot of internet cafes of groups of people who've been very vocal, increasingly vocal and visible in terms of expressing their discontent with the current state of affairs, and they're saying that there's been too many government handouts going to multicultural families at the expense of Koreans. So there's this growing anti-foreigner sentiment. So these are some of my observations. I think I'm running out of time. I'm going to try to do this really quickly. So far, I've talked about or tried to organize what I've observed so far, and then these are the additional questions that I'd like to answer as I proceed with my field research. The first is, what are the roles of corporations and market forces in supporting the multicultural project? So how is it that state, society, and the market forces interact in the functioning of multicultural policies? And the reason why I ask this is because one of the first major undertakings by the government to provide services for marriage migrants was through funding received by the Amora Pacific Corporation. A lot of people don't know about this. So there have been sort of major conglomerates as well as sort of small to medium-sized enterprises that have been very forthcoming in terms of their funding about supporting multicultural policies. Also, the agricultural cooperative 농협 has been funding and subsidizing marriage brokerage fees in many of the rural countrysides, and at one point they were actually acting as the broker itself, and that was considered a failed project. But so I wanted to look at why is it, or how are market forces influencing this game here? Second, are there differences in state civil society interactions between central and local levels? So far this project has been conducted in and around Seoul. But I'm really interested in getting to know what is happening in other parts of the country. So is what is happening at the local level just a microcosm of what's happening nationally? Or is it actually what's happening at the local level that's driving the central level policies? And so this is where, if possible, I'd like to take the opportunity to publicly request and encourage the involvement of any ETAs who are in the house tonight. If you're interested in this topic, if you're in the rural areas and if you've noticed a lot of, programs for multicultural families in your area, and if you want to join in on the project, please do let me know. Get in touch with me afterwards. The third question that I'd like to answer is, and I've posed this just now, what does multiculturalism mean in Korea? So this concept of multicultural is a political theory. One could say that originated in the kind of the liberal Western context, and Canada is often cited as an example of a country that most embodies the principles of multiculturalism, and this can be debated. But what is the role of civil society and state in the fashioning of multiculturalism? What does it mean to have multiculturalism Korean style? If at all, is that even possible? And then finally, what does this mean for citizenship in Korea? With this kind of social integration process and this approach to dealing with diversity, is it possible to have a more mature democratic form of citizenship, or will citizenship just devolve into something that's hierarchical and differentiated between different groups of people? Finally, in closing, I just wanted to say that this presentation is a bit of what I found so far and a preview of what is to come. So, with that in mind, I look forward to your comments and suggestions. And then a special thanks to the Korean American Education Commission, IAE Fulbright, Yonsei University, which is my host affiliation, Johns Hopkins University, and the Korean Women Migrant Human Rights Center. So with this, I'll end my presentation. Thank you. Yes, I have 10 minutes for a Q&A. It's okay? Yes?
I know that domestic violence is a particular problem among the marriage immigrant population. How much higher or lower is the rate of domestic violence between that group and Koreans? The general population.
That's a good question. I haven't looked at the exact figures of that. I just know that the brunt of the public attention has been on the rates of domestic violence and on divorce rates as well. But people have actually argued, I don't know about the rates of domestic violence to be honest, but in terms of divorce rates, people have argued that the rate of divorce among international marriages is actually lower than the rate of marriages among Koreans. And so there has been this kind of tendency by the media, because of the media hype, to kind of exaggerate the problems that are involved in international marriages, but when you put it in context and comparison to what's happening overall in Korean society, it might actually not be as exacerbated as it seems. But in terms of domestic violence, as far as I'm aware, it's comparable. But in terms of the divorce rates, it's much lower, even though it seems like it's much higher. Yeah?
I was wondering if you've seen how these multicultural centers, how they work in terms of working with the Joseon people who come over here through marriage, if there's specific programs for those who already speak the Korean language or have an understanding of the Korean language and Korean culture, but come over here and still have the potential of some culture shock.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, actually. There have actually been centers that have catered specifically to Joseonjok instead of the multicultural family centers, and a lot of the Joseonjok, instead of going to the multicultural family centers, if they're marriage migrants, tend to go to the Joseonjok organization. So there's been very active Joseonjok churches and religious organizations that cater just to Joseonjok, and this includes the migrant workers as well as the marriage migrants. But this doesn't mean that they don't frequent the multicultural family centers as well, and it really depends on the region and where they're living and where they're coming from. So if it happens to be kind of out in the countryside where there aren't Joseonjok organizations that they can turn to, then they tend to go to the multicultural family centers. But yeah, that's an excellent point, because these marriage migrants are actually a diverse group, and they come from different countries with different cultural backgrounds. But a lot of the programs don't really take this into account, right? It's just kind of, marriage migrants, they're all just kind of, there, we'll just provide them with services, but they don't actually cater them to their specific needs and whatnot. So a lot of Joseonjok marriage migrants have been marginalized in this process, but at the same time, people say, well, they don't really need it because they already have in some cases, the family networks, because a lot of Joseonjok already have family in the country, so they kind of tend to rely on more personal networks rather than through these public centers.
Yeah. It seems like you've collected most of your data through archival policy documents.
Yeah.
Do you have any plans of actually interviewing some of the multicultural families to see how those policies have trickled down into the actual family experiences?
I do. I have done interviews with a few public officials, but they've tended to be kind of low-ranking, right? Rather than the policymakers, they've tended to be policy implementers. And I've done actually the brunt of my interviews with activists in the NGOs. And when I'm at the centers, I've been able to kind of observe the migrant families as well. There's kind of a methodological problem in terms of accessing the multicultural families. So in Korea, as you can tell by kind of the attention paid to it, the scholars themselves too have been going way overboard with, everyone does multicultural. If you don't do multicultural, if you don't have a project, you don't have funding. And so a lot of people tend to be, all up in arms about doing research on multicultural families. And so a lot of the centers have become very, very protective about not letting researchers access the families, because it is very personal. It tends to touch upon very kind of confidential and personal matters as well. But I do have contacts, and I have interviewed not entire families, but the marriage migrants themselves, and kind of talked to them about the issues that they're facing. But it's interesting because you actually get more information from activists who are in between and are knowledgeable about the policies and what's going on at the grassroots level. Whereas when you talk to marriage migrants, they're not even aware of some of what the policies are. And a lot of them are just kind of, it's more kind of feelings of being lost and cultural disconnect, and not so much, oh, what are my rights, or what can I actually ask from the government, what should I be demanding. There's a lot less of that. So what a lot of the activists have been trying to do is to, yeah, exactly, educate them and say, well, there are these services and you have every right to claim them, but a lot of times, a lot of families are just, it's like, it's hard enough for them just to live on a day-to-day basis and communicate with their husbands or take care of their children, that they're not even thinking beyond that, even to begin with. So a lot of, and so the point is, a lot of people say, well, how effective are these multicultural family centers when, if it's the people who really, really need it, aren't even having access to the centers themselves? Because the people who do have access to the centers tend to be people who are kind of more middle income. They live in Seoul, they have access to transportation, they have childcare, for instance, like they can leave their kids somewhere and then go to the centers and get educated or whatever. But if you don't even have that at all, then what's the point of having centers when people who need it don't get it? Okay, wow. I'll go around this way.
Okay, mine, I'll try and keep it short, but
Okay.
it's kind of, first of all, I'm glad that you, right at the end, you developed a critical perspective, because you gave us a lot of data in the beginning, and for a long time didn't seem to sort, but in the end you basically answered a lot of the questions that I was formulating throughout the thing, including that Korea should make an attempt to accommodate to foreigners and negotiate its enculturations, rather than enforce a policy through which foreigners have to negotiate their own enculturations to accommodate Korea. But I think the whole crux of the thing is and I'll elaborate, is the marriage, the international marriage spike around 2005, and that came, interestingly, that came a few months after the abolishment of the hojujedo. And that tells me that when social infrastructure, when policy breaks down, if you have a weak social infrastructure, then all hell breaks loose. And that seems to be what happened, and evident in the international marriage peak. And I wonder, well, actually it's quite evident that, it's quite clear why Korean men are getting married to overseas women from overseas. But I wonder why, if you have any conceptions, or if you could explain why the social infrastructure was that weak that it motivated a peak in international marriages right after the abolishment of the hojujedo. I mean, if you have
project in itself,
yeah, it is, isn't it? Yeah, I have ideas, but I ask them.
Well, I mean, the breakdown of the hojujedo, I mean, that's the effects of it are still being seen to this day, right? We don't really know exactly.
Well, they're increasing, I think. The effects are increasing.
Oh, sure, yeah, and they will continue to increase, and we'll be able to kind of observe them more as time goes on. In terms of the social infrastructure, social policies, so I mean, Korea definitely, isn't really a welfare state, right? I mean, there's, in terms of the welfare provisions that it provides, it's all sort of family-based, not individual-based. That's kind of where the weakness comes in. And a lot of times, the men who are engaging in international marriage are the people who are considered socially, economically marginalized, right? A lot of times they're handicapped, they're widowed, they're mentally ill, physically ill,
the
poor.
rural area.
Right. So a lot of people have said, well, basically this is not an immigration policy, this is social policy. We're substituting the lack of a social policy by recruiting reproductive labor, and also caretakers, who are not really called caretakers, but they're called wives. But we're using them as caretakers, right? So in places like Japan, they're actually recruiting caretakers and nurses, foreign nurses, right? But Korea doesn't have that system. It's all been a family-based system of recruiting.
The guise of marriage.
Right. So I do think that, I do agree with you. I think that the Hoju system has an impact. I wouldn't be so sure to say that just because that ended, that it increased the number of international marriages significantly.
Strong contributing factor. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, but yeah, that remains to be seen. I don't think that's
world, yes.
exactly. Yeah, so I don't know if we can answer that question at this point, but it's worth thinking about. I think it's very interesting.
And I just quickly have one more thing. How has it's kind of a general consensus that the Sahoe Drive was just I don't want to say underhanded, because Kim Dae-jung was quite good, and the predecessors were quite good, and I have a lot of respect for them. But just to reaffirm nationalism, do you agree with that? Do you think that the Sahoe Drive was just an attempt to strengthen ethnic identity and nationalism?
Sahoe Drive.
Well, what I'm saying is this, but I'll break it down. During the Sahoe Drive, a lot of overseas Koreans were privileged, and that was the idea behind the Sahoe Drive, to privilege overseas Koreans. Yet Kim Dae-jung privileged only those overseas Koreans in Western countries.
Yep.
And he deprivileged.
Continues to be the case.
That's still the case.
That is still the case.
Really.
Yeah, I mean that's why they implemented the whole working visit thing. That was kind of a way to acknowledge that, oh, well, we do need to let in ethnic Koreans who are from China and from the Soviet Union, the poor
You
cousins.
mentioned that.
Right, yeah, but at the same time, they don't want to allow them the same rights granted to ethnic Koreans from the U.S., Canada, Japan, from the more wealthier countries, right?
So the working sectors that they've given access to, I wanted to ask you that, and you said, is that the lower level working sectors or employment sectors?
Yes,
Really?
it is just low-skilled labor.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, some people say that this whole multicultural project is still part of the Sahoe Tribe.
Yeah.
It's still a part of the way to, and that multiculturalism is actually really Korean nationalism.
Yeah.
That it's not really, it's just in name multiculturalism, but it's a way to strengthen Korean national identity. And that goes, and that's kind of the reason why I showed the ethnic breakdown of all the migrants. The majority of migrants are ethnic Koreans. They're not even, non-ethnic Koreans, right? So if you're saying that the recruitment of ethnic Koreans as foreigners is multicultural, then isn't that just strengthening national identity?
Reaffirming ethnic homogeneity. Sure.
Right.
And my absolute last thing is, if I was to ask you, what do you think would be the number one contributing factor to strengthening ethnic homogeneity or ethnic nationalism, what would that be? What would be the number one factor that strengthens that? Why is it this inculcated attempt, or this attempt to inculcate ethnic nationalism in Korea? What's motivating that? And that's going right down to the grassroots, isn't it? It's going, to find the basic influence.
I've struggled with that question for a very long time, and I don't think I have a clear answer to that at this point. So I've struggled with the notion of developmentalism, right? Developmental economic nationalism. And all of this, there's an economic motivation, right, behind labor migration. And so it seems to me that it's this mentality that Korea still hasn't become a developed country. It's still not 선진국. It still has to become advanced. It's this kind of very driving force that I don't know how that's coupled with ethnic nationalism, or if that's what is causing ethnic nationalism, or if that is what ethnic nationalism is, if that's the essence of what ethnic nationalism is, right?
That may be Confucianism. Is there a Confucianist? Because Confucianist influences are quite strong on individual ethnic identity and the ethnic identity void.
People have argued that social scientists tend to be very suspicious of cultural explanations, right? So technically, I'm not supposed to subscribe to that view. Yes. Sorry, I'll take some other questions. Who's that? Oh, okay, 2 more questions. Okay, yeah, sure. Yeah.
Another serious issue starting from the multicultural families is the education of the multicultural family children or students. And as far as I know, there are only 9% or 10% of multicultural family children or students get entrance to the high school in Korea, and it's pretty incredible ratio in Korea. If you're considering the status of Korean normal students, it's over 90%, 95% entering to the universities and high school students. So what is your thinking about considering the educational status of the multicultural family children and students, and how is it considered serious among the centers or scholars?
I didn't get the first part of your question. I didn't hear the first part of the question.
So what do you think about the parent educational status about
educational status?
About the students from multicultural family?
Right. No, thank you. That's an excellent question. And the scholarship on multiculturalism in Korea now currently is going through a shift where the first generation was kind of on these policies on marriage migrants, right? And the second generation tends to be on the multicultural children themselves, which is becoming an even greater problem because they're actually, Korean citizens, right, who are born to Korean fathers, who are being very much marginalized in the education system. Like you said, like the high school admissions rates, but even below that, at the elementary and junior high school levels, a lot of the children are either refusing to go to school or just dropping out altogether because they can't adjust to either because they can't adjust to it or because they've been bullied out of the system. That I don't know. And then even some junior highs, even though by law residents in Korea are entitled to, up through a junior high school education, a lot of the schools themselves are refusing admission to multicultural children, who's saying that, they don't have the resources to accommodate children with, special needs and whatnot. And so there have been the creation either through government funding or through grassroots organizations to create alternate schools, right? Alternate 대안학교, things like that, to foster, the different education system or style to multicultural children. But that itself has also been criticized too, because you're basically creating a separation between multicultural children and Korean children and educating them in completely separate ways, right? And then saying, okay, when they grow up, they'll all just kind of integrate and live together and be happy and it'll be fine. But we don't know that that's going to be the case, right? And so the majority of multicultural children are still in primary and secondary education. And then, in a couple of years, they'll all be going into, either college or the workforce. And the kinds of problems that will arise from that due to, lack of integration or to, continuing ethnic discrimination and marginalization of these children, that's been very worrisome for for scholars and policymakers, and no one really has a solution. That's the scary part. Like, we don't know. And Korea, this is the first time Korea is going through this, and so a lot of times in discussions, people say, "Oh, well, what do they do in America? What do they do in Canada? Let's look at other countries. What do they do in Japan? And let's try to adopt elements of those policies." But yeah, just to answer your question, the Ministry of Culture and Education has been trying. It's been doing a lot. It's been, publishing a lot of textbooks and saying, well, this is the way, teachers need to treat their children and don't, discriminate the children, blah, blah, blah. But as to whether it's working, that there's still being a lot of studies done. We don't really know. We don't know. And that's the scary part.
Did you say 90% don't go to high school? What was the number?
Yeah, less than 10%.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, it's a huge problem. Sorry, I think we have time for one last question. Is that okay? Yeah. Is that a hand or no?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
You talked about how in rural areas there's a lot of companies that are providing services, and those can be the people who need the services the most. But I'm curious to hear more about that. Like, how, is it pretty soul-centered, the way that services are being provided, or are there a lot of organizations in rural areas? What do you know about that?
I'm glad you asked that question, because I don't really know the answer to that question, because that's why I tend to, go out into the countrysides and do more field research in that respect. From sort of archival reports, the role of grassroots organizations tend to be even more important in the rural areas, right? Because the government has done its best to center and kind of space out the centers, but they're still concentrated in kind of city centers, right? And not in just out in the middle of nowhere. So what they've done in order to address that problem is to, like I said, kind of dispatch I don't know what the word is, but people to go out into the homes and become tutors multicultural tutors for the family. So they actually go and visit the home and teach the children and the mother about different things. But a lot of people don't actually like that idea. So how effective that program has been is questionable, right? But there are a lot of grassroots organizations, especially in the Daegu and Busan area, that have done to provide a lot of services, and they tended to be kind of migrant workers, activist groups, but then now they're branching out into providing services for the marriage migrants as well. But yeah, I'm really interested too. I want to see what is going on in the countrysides. Thank you.
Thank you very much.